Well, over the last couple weeks in some of the other churches, we've had a few people die, and it's always a sad time to see people die. We had a man in Savannah who we've known for a few years who died after, I guess a lengthy illness, and then a man in Jacksonville died the week after him. And while it's sad to see those people go, I will have to say that in talking with some of their relatives in the aftermath of their death, I was heartened by their lives. In one case, the son of the man didn't come to church at all, and really I don't know if he had any idea of ever keeping the Sabbath day, but he told me, one thing I know about my dad, and I always knew about him, it had to be the Sabbath day. I always knew what the Sabbath day was, and he didn't go on to say that he didn't keep it, but he said, there's the thing about my dad, he always kept the Sabbath day, and he knew what was going to happen to him after he died. And I thought for someone who didn't come to church, that was a good thing to hear about his dad. In another case, a lady, a niece who had been attending them in their illness, made the comment, and she'd come to church a few times, and she made the comment, when I go back home, I think I'm going to start attending the church. And that speaks loudly about the lives of those people. They had made an impact on those people in the short time they were around them or in their entire lives, that upon their demise, there were some solid statements. And no matter what they do with the truth from that time forward, those lives spoke very highly to them. It reminded me as I was hearing these things of a verse back here in Hebrews 11. So let's go back to Hebrews 11. We were there during the sermon that time. But in Hebrews 11, verse 4, there's a very heartening verse here. Among the many, of course, Hebrews 11 is the faith chapter where we have many of the men and women that exhibited tremendous faith in God through all their trials listed here. But in verse 4, it takes us back to one of the very first human beings on earth. It says, by faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. And through it, he being dead still speaks. Abel was, maybe the fourth human being on the earth. Been dead for 5,000 years, or more than that. And one act that we know about, that we read about back in Genesis 4, by his action, he still speaks to us. Through all the ages and through all the times, that one action we're talking about today. Because Abel, in his very short life, and he lived a very short time, what he did spoke volumes to us about how we should live our lives. So today I want to talk about 4 people of faith, and I want to look at their lives and see how they spoke to the people that were living with them at that time, how they speak to us. And I want us to think about, what do our lives say to the people around us? What do they say to our friends, our neighbors, our children, our brothers and sisters, people who may not come to church, but people who know what you believe and begin to watch what you do through your life? Does our life speak volumes to them, like we heard in a couple instances, or certainly like Abel's do? Let me preface here the sermon with the first 3 verses of Hebrews 11, because one thing all the men that I talk about today have in common, and that we must simply have if we're ever going to have anyone speak of us after we die, in a positive nature relating to God and our belief in Him, is faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. You know that. It's right there in Hebrews 11, verse 6. And all these men had faith, but let's read verses 1 through 3 of Hebrews 11 here. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. It brings the future right here into the present. We hope and we know and we believe in the kingdom of God, but it's here now because we know it. And so it's the substance of things hoped for. It's the evidence of things not seen. It's the thing that we so believe in our hearts, that we believe God, that we would be willing to give up anything in our lives to have the kingdom of God or to be in it. Sacrifice our own will, sacrifice whatever it takes, because we believe it and we believe that that kingdom so far surpasses anything that the world has to offer. By it, verse 1 says, or verse 2 says, the elders obtained a good testimony, a good report. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. And then he goes right in and starts talking about Abel. What was it about Abel? What did Abel do that was so noteworthy that here 5,000 plus years later we're still talking about him? Let's go back to Genesis 4. You know the story, but let's just read the words right from the Bible. And as you're turning there, remember that Abel was in a family with a mom and dad that rejected God. When they had the opportunity to choose God after walking with him or reject him, they decided they were going to take matters into their own hands, that they were going to dictate their way of life. So that was their mom and dad. We know he had an older brother, Cain. We know what Cain was like. We know what he was capable of. So Abel was in a family that didn't really revere God. They knew God. They kind of knew he existed. And we see here that Cain, as we read through the verses, knew that he was supposed to do something to honor God, but Abel was cut out of a different fabric. Chapter 4, verse 1. Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain and said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. And she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Eternal. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of the fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he didn't respect Cain and his offering. Cain became angry. He allowed that anger to grow, and it eventually led into the murder of Abel. Just a few short verses there. And Abel, who lived a short life, did something in these verses that God counted so worthy that he named him in Hebrews 11. And makes the comment there that by his action, he still speaks to us. Well, we know from these verses that Cain believed there was a God. How can you not believe there was a God if you were one of the first few people on earth? That his mom and dad believed in God, and God taught them in some manner how to worship him. And he taught them about offerings and that they should bring something to him. Otherwise, why would Cain and Abel have been bringing an offering at all? And you know, when God works with us, he's pretty specific on what he wants us to do. He doesn't leave anything to chance. He tells us, do it this way, do it exactly that way, don't add to it, don't take away from it. Do exactly the way I tell you. And his word to them then would have been very clear, just as his word to us today is very clear as we read in the Bible. But we have two young men. Cain comes with an offering, kind of obeying what God had said. He lays it there before God, but God rejects it. Abel comes with an offering. He brings it before God. God accepts it. What was the difference in the two men? They both went through the same process. They both brought something to God. What did he see in Abel? What did he see in Abel that he didn't see in Cain? Well, he saw someone who believed God with all his heart. He saw someone who so respected God that whatever God said he would do. Cain was going through the motions. There was something he had to do. This was the day to bring the offering, put something together, and bring it to God. Abel, on the other hand, took time with his offering. He remembered exactly what God had told him to do. He had a heart and he had an attitude, and when he brought that offering before God, God saw the whole package. It was done exactly the way that he said it should be done. He saw the heart of Abel. He was there to honor God, to bring honor to him, and to show his reverence for him. And he saw the attitude of Cain. Whatever you say, I'm going to do it exactly the way you say to do it. Cain, on the other hand, went through the process, but just kind of did it. He didn't have the heart that he was really bringing that offering to honor God or thank God or whatever the purpose that they were offering it there. He didn't have the attitude, may have been a little bit more lackadaisical. I have to do it because God says to do it, so I'll do it. And so you have two different men, two different offerings, one God. They kind of represent the two ways of life that we can be. We can sit in church every week and go through the motions, or we can live God's way of life every day and every minute of our lives. We can allow God to transform the way we think, truly convert us. Abel was just a young man, and he came out of a very difficult circumstance. Mom and Dad had already made a choice. My way, not God's way. Cain apparently made the same choice. My way, not God's way. Abel, out of a tough environment, said, I'm doing it God's way. I'm doing it God's way. I worship him. I honor him. He had faith because he wouldn't have done it if he didn't believe that he was God. And out of that faith came obedience. How do we worship God? Let's go back to Matthew 2 for a second here. In Matthew 2, we find another incident of worship. As Jesus Christ is born, there are men from the east who are coming to, as we will see, worship him. Matthew 2, verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and we've come to worship him. Verse 9. After they depart from Herod, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented to him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They came to worship the child that God led them to come and worship. He was the promised Messiah, now born, whose life would change the earth, and his death would open up the way for all of mankind to salvation. And they came to worship him. And in this verse, in this few verses here, we see a little bit of what's entailed in worship. First of all, the Greek word for worship is proskuneo, P-R-O-S-K-U-N-E-O. It means to submit to, be in obeisance to, revere someone. You know, we might casually use the word, I worship someone. We probably don't. We would hopefully just use the word of worship to God. But you might hear someone in the world say, they worship this person. Well, when these wise men came, what they did when they came to Jesus Christ was, number one, they came to him. God led them, and they came before the Christ child, just as God had commanded them to do. Now, we come to Sabbath services every week. We come here because we honor God, we worship him, and we want to show him our respect for him and the time that we are willing to sacrifice to give to him, and so that he can work with his church and develop it and us individually. When they came before him, they fell down before him. They were in such awe at what they were seeing that they fell down before him. And so many times in the Bible, when you see people coming into God's presence or the angel's presence, they fall down. They're just absolutely dumbfounded by the magnificence they're in front of. How do we worship God? Is that part of our attitude? That when we come before him at Sabbath services, when we come before him in prayer, when we come before him in Bible study, when we come before him in anything that we do, are we in such awe? Do we see him as such a powerful being that he holds eternity in his hands? Abel felt that. Abel knew that. We must know that if we're going to please God. If we have faith in him, we may not all fall down on our faces here in this room, because today we worship God in spirit and truth, but our attitudes when we come before him, are they of such reverence, of such thanks? Do we recognize in whose presence we come? When we come before him at church, in prayer, in Bible study. And when these wise men came, they brought him gifts. They brought something to offer to him because they held him in such high esteem. And they didn't just stop off at the nearest Target and pick up something to bring him. They brought him the very best: gold, frankincense, myrrh. They wanted to show him the deep respect. Only the best would we give to the Christ child in their case, only the best would we give to God. When Abel came before God, he came in an attitude of worship. It was born through the faith that he had in God and the belief that he had in him. But the way he worshiped, and the way we should worship in spirit and truth, should speak volumes about us. That somewhere down the road, whether it's while we're still alive or after we die, and someone looks at us and they would say, you know what? His actions spoke loudly. He worshiped his God. Whatever his God said to do, he did it. And he never held anything back. And he never withheld anything from him. Abel did. And Abel still speaks to us today. Let's go back to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, and very next man in the list, and we're not going to go through all of these here, but the next man on the list is another man we know very little about. We have very little recorded about his life. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he didn't see death, and he wasn't found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony, that he pleased God. He pleased God. Wouldn't it be nice to have said of us, he pleases God. She pleases and she pleased God. Enoch had that testimony. He pleased God. And then the next verse says, without faith it's impossible to please him. He who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Enoch had this testimony. He had faith. He pleased God. There's other people that the Bible tells us God is pleased with. One that you can think of right offhand, right? Jesus Christ. This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased. John 8, verse 29, you don't need to turn there. But in John 8, verse 29, Christ, in whom God the Father was well pleased, said, I always. And you know, when Christ says the word always, it's different than the way you and I use the word always, isn't it? I can say always, but it means, hopefully most of the time, I always, Christ said, I always do what pleases my Father. I always do what pleases my Father. Enoch had this testimony. He pleased God. He's another man who, lived comparatively short for the people in his time. He lived to be 365 years old, while the rest of the people around him were, if you take into account in Genesis, living 900 years. But let's go back and read a little bit, the few verses we have on Enoch. We have one testimony of him here in Hebrews. He pleased God. And back in Genesis 5 and verse 21, we read this about him. It says, Enoch lived 65 years and he begat Methuselah. Methuselah lived 969 years, you remember, the one who is recorded to have lived the longest. After he begat Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years, and he had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God. And he was not, for God took him. Now you notice what it says twice in that verse, or in those verses we read. Enoch walked with God. And then at the conclusion, and Enoch walked with God. And then he was not, because God took him. You're familiar with Amos 3:3. Remember Amos 3:3? It says, can two walk together unless they be agreed? Can they walk together unless they be agreed? Enoch walked with God. Enoch agreed with God. Now we walk with people, and it's kind of nice to take a stroll sometime, isn't it? Maybe we walk with our spouse, maybe we walk with a friend, maybe it's something you do regularly. And when you walk with someone, it's kind of nice to have the conversation. Makes the time go by. There's a lot of give and take, and it's an easy conversation and a pleasant walk. And when you see two people walking along together and they're side by side, you figure that they're friends, they're mates, they're whatever. because you see them walking together. And if they didn't know each other, they wouldn't be walking together in such an easy state. There'd be some kind of tension between them. Sometimes you can walk through the neighborhood and you can observe people, and you see husband and wife walking together. And other times you see, if you watch them, husband move out way ahead of the wife. Or you might see wife drop back. You might even see her take a turn on the corner street. And you think, I don't think they're walking in agreement right now. I think things aren't going the way that they should. You know, when we walk with God, we walk with someone who's always right. I might walk with Debbie, and I may be totally wrong, and she might be totally right in some area, but there's that little bit of disagreement that might make the walk a little less easy. But with God, we know He's always right. He's always right. He has all the answers. If we ever find ourselves moving back behind or stepping forward or turning off on the next corner, it's not His problem. It's our problem. God called us, and He wants us to walk with Him. Enoch walked with God. When we are in agreement with God, we will walk with Him. Let's go back to Psalm 1. You'll recognize the words to this psalm. You know, Enoch wasn't the only one who walked with God. While we were back there in Genesis, I could have had you turn to chapter 6, and there you would see that Noah walked with God. And in chapter 17, God told Abraham, walk before me and be perfect, be blameless. God wants the same thing for us. He wants us to walk with Him. Psalm 1, verse 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. Here's the one who has a choice. He can walk with God or he can walk in counsel that isn't of Him, and he chooses not to. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. Blessed is the man who doesn't stand in the path of sinners, who doesn't sit in the seat of the scornful. This man who eschews or who doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in His law he meditates day and night. That's what he thinks about. That's where he's trying to be, like God, letting His Holy Spirit permeate his mind, direct his thinking, put the pieces all together, fill in the dots and fill in the spaces so that we understand how good, how perfect God's law is, and what life will be like in His kingdom when everyone is living by that law. The person that does this, he will be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. Enoch walked with God. He was in harmony with Him. He listened to what God had to say, and when God said do it, Enoch didn't. He didn't arch his back, head off on the side street, and say, no, I'm not going to do it that way. When we walk with God, we learn His way. We learn His laws. We learn His words. We learn His will. And we alter our course so that we're walking alongside beside Him as He lets us see the places where we may be walking out of line, or we may not be perfectly aligned with Him. Enoch had this testimony. He walked with God. He pleased God. Back in Micah 6 and verse 8, Micah 6, verse 8. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. To walk humbly with Him. Developing that closeness, developing that bond, and walking with Him every day for the rest of your life, right up until the time that God takes you. Just like He took Enoch, until the day you die. never getting tired, never growing weary, never lagging behind, but walking with him, side by side. You know, as Enoch walked with God, and as we walk with God, he opens our minds to more of his plan. Each year, each decade, we know more and more about who God is, what his plan is, what we need to change in order to become more like him. And it was the same with Enoch. Back in Jude, we have another mention of Enoch. In the book of Jude, in verse 14, here's a man who lived before the flood, who's been dead 4,000 years. There was a flood that was going to wipe out everything on earth except Noah and his family and the animals on that ark. But God let him see and gave him the vision of what his plan was. Jude 14, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men, and the verses leading up to it talks about false prophets in the last days and things, prophesied about these men saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints." He's going to return to earth, and with him are going to be his saints, the people who have yielded to him, who have chosen him after God called them, who dedicated their lives to him, who had faith, who worshiped him, and who walked with him. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all, and to convict all who are ungodly among them. And the verse goes on. As you walk with God, he'll give you more and more of a vision of what his plan is. More of a vision of the promises that he's made to us. More of a vision of his kingdom and what life will be like. And that vision should motivate us. Should motivate us to keep walking, because if we have it, and if we know what God is working out below, if we know what his purpose is, there's nothing on earth that compares, nothing on earth that would be worth trading it for. Enoch walked with God. Will part of our legacy be that people would say, he walked with God? Will God say, he pleased God? Let's talk about another man. We won't go back to Hebrews for him. Joseph is, I think, one of my favorite characters in the Bible. You know, he went through so much in his life, and I think we all can identify with him in so many areas. But Joseph, if we look at him in the context of today's society and in our church today, he was a church kid. He was born into the church. He grew up in the church. He kind of knew from the beginning the truth of God, and he was taught by his father what the principles of God are. He had an interesting life. I mean, he was rich, he was wealthy. He didn't really know any want from the time that he was born. And he was the favorite son of his father. So Joseph, for the first 17 years of his life, had it pretty good, you might say. He was living with someone, and he was at the top of the heap in his family. But because of those things that he had, his brothers got jealous, and one day they decided they were going to sell him into slavery. And they did. And so Joseph, at 17 years of age, just 17 years of age, finds himself in a strange land with strange people speaking a strange language and worshiping strange gods. And he has no one around him that thinks like him. Dad's gone. Brothers are gone. He's all by himself. And now he's a slave from the top of the heap where he was all the way to the bottom of the heap. Never pictured himself in that position. What would we do in that situation? What would a young man do? He could have embraced Egypt. He could have said, forget all this. You know, I just have when in Egypt do as the Egyptians. Isn't that what the song says? I guess it's when in Rome do as the Romans, isn't it? When in Rome do as the Romans. But look how Joseph lived his life. Look at what he learned during those 17 years that he didn't let go of. He clung to. And he's a good example for all of us and for all the young people as well. When he found himself in this untenable and unimaginable situation, what did he do when he was at the bottom of the heap in Potiphar's household? He worked hard. You might not even know if Joseph worked. I mean, he was wealthy, he was the favorite son of his father, but when he got there, he worked hard. He was a diligent young man. And you know what? He was honest, too. He had been taught some principles in his life, and he applied those even at 17 years of age when life turned his world upside down. And Potiphar, who's watching this young man that he purchased at some slave market, sees something in him. And Joseph's actions are speaking loudly to him. This kid works hard. I can entrust anything into his care. I don't have to go after he leaves the room and count the coins or count the objects on the shelf there. It's all there. I can trust him. Speaks loudly of him. And Joseph rises from bottom of the heap up into top of the heap in Potiphar's household, and everything is going along well until Potiphar's wife takes a look, and she likes what she sees, and she decides she's going to throw a little temptation his way. And you know the story. Here again, Joseph is a young man. He might have thought, hey, she's my master's wife. Who's going to know? She's certainly not going to run and tell Potiphar. But look what he did. And in the words that he says in that occasion, he speaks loudly to us. Let's go back to Genesis 39 and see that occasion. Genesis 39. As Potiphar's wife continues her conquest, Joseph finally turns to her and he says, we'll pick it up in verse 8. He refused her and said to his master's wife, look, my master doesn't know what is with me in the house, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. There's no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? He could have said, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against Potiphar? But he said, how can I do this? And how can I sin against God? There's a depth in what Joseph said there that shows what was in his heart. During these years he was in Potiphar's household, as he was working in a strange land, in a strange home, as he was doing what his father had told him to do, he came to love God. He was walking with God. He had faith in God. Even though his circumstances had turned upside down, he believed in the God his father had taught him about. And he was walking with him, and he was applying everything he had learned. He remembered what Joseph had taught him. And as he did those things, and as he prayed, or whatever relationship he did with God, he came to love God, and he loved him deeply. You know how it is, and I don't really have a good example for this, but you know you love someone, so much that you would give up something you want to do because you know they don't want you to do it. You ever do that? Maybe it's your husband, your wife, and it's not anything even necessarily a sin. Maybe just something you want to do, or maybe something you want to buy, but you know they're against it. And you look at it and you think, you know what? It's right there. I'm the one who makes the money, so I should buy it. But you think, no, I won't do it because I don't want her to be upset. Or maybe it was your parents when you were younger, and something you could have gotten yourself involved in, but you thought, no, I won't do that because I wouldn't want to hurt them, and I wouldn't want to do it against them. That's the kind of love that Joseph had for God. I'm not going to do this. I won't sin against God. I won't disappoint him in that way. Now that speaks volumes about the young man, doesn't it? In our lives, when we're tempted, when we're faced with something, do we stop and we think, no, I won't do that. I won't do that and sin against God because I love him so much, because I appreciate what he has done for me, because I worship him, and because I realize all the future is in his hands. And he didn't have to give me anything, but I will live the way of life he wants me to live. Well, Joseph made a loud statement that still speaks to us today. But then as a result of that, he found himself in prison. Another twist of fate. From the top of the heap in Potiphar's house, now down at the bottom of the heap in prison. But Joseph, in that situation, didn't lose hope, didn't lose faith, didn't think, well, that worked out great. What did he do? He did the same thing that he did before. He worked hard. He was honest. He was trustworthy. The prison guards began to see there's something different about this man. His actions and who he is speak volumes about him, and he's different than the rest of the prisoners. And slow, he began to climb to the top of the heap there as well. God gave him a gift to interpret dreams, and when two men, the butler and baker, came to him and asked him to interpret their dreams, God gave him the interpretation. The butler was set free. He said, I'm going to tell Pharaoh about you. And he was released. But he didn't say anything for 2 years. Joseph didn't give up hope. He just kept doing what he was doing. He just kept working hard. He just kept obeying God. He just kept trusting in him that things would happen the way that he intended for him to happen. And then came the day when Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret. And the butler remembered there's this young man in prison who can do that. And here's Joseph, a prisoner, 30 years old, for the last 13 years working as a slave, and part of those years in prison, being brought before the greatest man on earth at that time, the head of the greatest nation on earth, brought from the dungeons or wherever the prisons were to be brought before Pharaoh. And in chapter 41, Joseph does something and says something that, again, should speak to us as we go through our lives. Here he is standing in front of Pharaoh. And chapter 41 and verse 15, Pharaoh says to Joseph, I've had a dream. There's no one who can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that you can understand the dream to interpret it. I don't know. If Joseph had just said, yes, Pharaoh, I can. That would have been a kind of a natural response. Yes, I can. Not thinking anything about it. But notice what Joseph does. In front of the greatest man on earth, in front of the audience that he had, in the greatest nation on earth at that time, Joseph answered Pharaoh saying, it's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. It's not of me. Whatever I tell you, it's God who did it. I think that spoke loudly to Pharaoh, loudly to the people that were around that day, loudly to us. Do we give God credit for the things and the changes he's made in our life? Do we ever look back and think, what would my life have been if God hadn't called me? What type of person would I be like? Where would I be? What would I be doing? And if we think about it and we really understand our own weaknesses and faults and where we were back then, we probably shudder when we think about it. And we should at that point be very thankful and literally fall down on our face before God and thank him for what he has done to save us from the life that we would have had otherwise if he hadn't given us his Spirit and the understanding of his way of life. Joseph said, I'm giving credit to God. It's him who does it. It's not me. Throughout his life, we won't go into it, but as he comes face to face with his brothers, he forgives them. You heard a sermon on forgiveness last week. He forgives them. That'd be a tough thing to do if your brothers and your family had sold you into slavery, hoped you were dead, but then by accident, well, not accident, because Joseph says everything works out. God has a purpose of what he's doing. And he forgives them. And he speaks loudly. But maybe the thing that he did that is most noticeable is at the time he's going to die. Let's go to Genesis 50 and verse 24. Now here, Joseph is 110 years old. For 80 years, he's been in favor in the land of Egypt. He's led a very good life. He was the toast of the town. Back at the time, he was made second in command of all of Egypt. He was the toast of the town as he was commanding the storehouses and as the grain was issued out to people during the years of famine. He was held in high esteem by Pharaoh and his courts. He lived a very good life. Joseph never wanted anything, and when he brought his family in, they were well taken care of as well. It was a good life, physically, in Egypt. Nothing to want for, nothing to be ashamed of, and for 80 years, Joseph lived this way. He might have thought, this is about as good as it can get. The way my life has turned out, even though it was tough in the early days, it turned out pretty good. But on his dying bed, in verse 24, this is what Joseph says to his brothers. I'm dying. But he says, God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here he was. In the land of Egypt, everything was great. After 80 years, he calls his brothers and says, or his brethren, God's going to visit you. You will leave this land. He will take you to the land he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. After 80 years, through a very good life, he remembered that promise, and that promise still guided him. No matter how good it was in Egypt, no matter how much he had, no matter how many people were patting him on the back and saying, good job, Joseph, take whatever you want, he kept his vision and he kept his outlook on the promised land. Going on in the verse, it says, then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here. I don't want to stay buried in Egypt. God is going to take you to the promised land. Promise me that you're going to take my bones and they go where God said he wanted his people to be. Did Joseph have faith? Oh, yes, he had faith. Did Joseph walk with God? Yes, he walked with God. Did he demonstrate so many of the other Christian responsibilities that we have? Yes, he did. And even in a very good life, in a very materialistically good life, he never lost until his dying day the vision of the promised land. No matter how good things got for him, and they got very good. You think that spoke loudly to his brethren that day? Do you think when they came back, when God did deliver them from Egypt, and they came back and got his bones and transported him to the promised land, do you think it spoke volumes to the people that day? It should still speak volumes to us today. We walk with God, but we can never lose sight, no matter how good things go in this life, of the kingdom that God has promised us. Never forgetting that whatever this life has to offer, even if it's very, very, very good, doesn't compare to the kingdom that he gave us. We never lose sight of that. We never become enamored with what we have now, knowing that the future that God has given us holds so much more. Now let's go back to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 and verse 22. Of all the things that Joseph did, in verse 22, as he's mentioned in the book of Hebrews 11, it says, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. He never lost the vision. Mr. Schultz read to you, but let's go back to verse 13 in Hebrews 11. Speaking of all the people here in Hebrews 11, and everyone who has died in faith, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them. They believed them with all their heart. They embraced them. They could touch it. They could feel it. And they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had the opportunity to return, but now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Joseph, what he did, his legacy speaks volumes. One more man. We don't find him in Hebrews 11 because he lived in New Testament times. And you could do this with many of the men and women in the Bible. Paul, the Apostle Paul. You know, Joseph, if we want to use the modern day comparison, grew up in the church, and he applied everything he learned. Paul didn't grow up in the church. Paul was converted somewhere in his adult life. He was raised a Jew. He kept all the ordinances and all the traditions of the Jews. But then on the road to Damascus, well, he even persecuted Christians, right? He was a very zealous, a very aggressive guy. He took pleasure in finding people who believed in Jesus Christ rather than keeping the traditions of the elders. He would love to come into this room and start taking down names and addresses, and he'd round us all up. But then, when he was called, when his mind was open, when God opened his mind on that road to Damascus, what did Paul do? He turned on a dime. He left his former life behind. All of us have a former life. Whether we were raised in the church or not, there are things when God calls us and he opens our minds and we know this is the truth, he expects us to follow. Paul followed. He turned his life around, and it was kind of a whiplash thing because people who saw him one day, when they saw him 3 and 5 days later, didn't know who he was. He was a totally different guy with a totally different mission in life. That speaks volumes to us. But Paul, when he was called, he learned. He had this great, energetic personality. But he learned from God, and you know his life wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at all. You know, if God had told Paul, this is what's going to happen to you, Paul. In fact, let's go over to 2 Corinthians 11. And in this chapter here, Paul recounts some of the things that he went through as a part of his calling. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 24. He had a tough life after he came in to the church, if you will. And as you read through these things, sometimes we read words, and I'm guilty of this. I read words, and I've read these scriptures I don't even know how many times. But sometimes we just need to stop and think, what do those words mean? Paul says in verse 24, "From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1." You know, I don't even know what 1 stripe feels like. I have no idea what it would be like to have someone take a whip and whap it across my back. Can't imagine. I don't even really want to find out. But Paul had that happen to him 395 times. 395 times after he came in, after God called him. That was part of his road to salvation, part of what God called him to. 395 times, stripes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. I have no idea what that is. Every once in a while I hear something about a caning over in the Middle East. I have no idea what that feels like. Paul went through it 3 times. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've been in the deep. In journeys often. In perils of waters. In perils of robbers. In perils of my own countrymen. In perils of the Gentiles. In perils in the city. In perils in the wilderness. In perils in the sea. In perils among false brethren. In weariness and toil. In sleeplessness often. In hunger and thirst. In fastings often. In cold and nakedness. Wow. Besides the other things. What comes upon me daily? My deep concern for all the churches. Can you imagine if God called you and said, well, this is what from here to the end of your life you're going to endure, and he listed those things for you? It would open your eyes, wouldn't it? Well, he didn't tell Paul that, but you know, Paul went through all that. And Paul never gave up. You know, he might have said after the second time he received 40 stripes minus 1, I've had enough, okay? There's only so much my body can take. This isn't what I bargained for. But he didn't give up. 5 times he went through that, and all these other things that he's listed. Whatever God threw at him, he never gave up. He never lost sight of what God had called him to. He continued to walk with God. He continued to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. He had more faith as he went through those things. And you know why he did it? Just going through it speaks volumes. He did it because God, that was part of his path of doing it. And he references it here in the last verse that he read, but let's go back to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy 2. In 2 Timothy, he's knowing that his life is about to end. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 10, he says, "Therefore I endure all things." Notice that? "Therefore I endure all things for the sake of the elect, that they also may obtain the salvation which is in Christ Jesus with eternal glory." Whatever God puts me through, I will endure it. And I will do it for their sake. He did it for God because God called him to do it, but he was so concerned and he loved the brethren so much, he was willing to do whatever it took and endure whatever he needed to because he wanted them to receive salvation as well. Now, do you think that Paul's sufferings spoke volumes to the people who heard about those things? They knew what he was doing. He was so committed to preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ that he was willing to endure all that pain. And he did it that others might hear, that they might understand the joy that comes from it. See how God transformed Paul? Look at the love that this man has. It's the opposite of what he was like before he was called. Before, he just wanted to hurt people, kill them, turn them from Christ. Now he was willing to suffer all this so that people could receive the truth. Who better to write 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, that talks about agape love? Because he lived it. He lived it and he demonstrated it. Who better to write Romans 12, verse 1, "Give your body as a living sacrifice to God"? Because Paul did it. And he speaks volumes to us about never discounting the importance of our calling, never discounting the importance of the promises that God has given us, never losing sight of what he's called us to. In 2 Timothy 4, verse 7, he says, "There's laid up for me a crown of righteousness." He did all those things that we've talked about. And it still speaks loudly to us today. Back in Acts 20. Back in Acts 20 and verse 22. In this chapter, he's talking to the church in Ephesus. He's been there for 3 years. He's about to depart. He doesn't know if he's going to see them again. They don't know if they're going to see him. And so it's kind of a tearful and sad departure that he has, but he's giving them a lot of admonition and a lot of teaching here. In verse 22 of Acts 20, he says, "See now, I go bound in the Spirit to Jerusalem. I don't know the things that will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies in every city, saying that chains and tribulations await me." And then he says, "But none of these things move me." Nothing's going to separate me from the mission that God has called me to. Not the hard things of life, not the good things of life. None of these things move me. Nor do I count my life dear to myself, so that I may finish the race with joy, and the ministry which I received from the Lord Jesus, to testify to the gospel of the grace of God. Of all the things, they don't matter to me. My whole mission and my whole focus, Paul said, is to finish the race that God gave me, to finish the job he gave me to do. Nothing's going to stand in the way. Not the good things in life that can be more of a trial sometimes than the tough things in life. Nothing's going to separate me from finishing the race. He had a purpose in his mind. He committed himself. and with God's Holy Spirit to give him the strength, he was going to finish the race. No number of beatings, no number of canings, none of the good times, nothing was going to separate him or keep him from finishing the race. The people at that time saw what Paul did. They knew his life. What he did, how he handled himself, spoke volumes to them, still speaks volumes to us today. Do we have faith? Do we walk with God? Do we have a vision, and is that vision ever growing in our minds as we let God do that? And have we committed that nothing in this life is going to keep us from finishing the race that God has called us to? If we have, our lives will speak volumes to the people who know us, to the people who live on after our time on this earth is done. Let's conclude in Hebrews 11. I'm just going to finish by reading, beginning in verse 32 through the first few verses of chapter 12, that well encapsulate the things that we've talked about today. Hebrews 11, verse 32. What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God.